guys. So we're back to talk about the two sentences that you had for the second assignment on syntactic categories. So the first sentence is, on the court, she openly displayed a perfectly outrageous cheek towards the officials who had recently been appointed by the club. Now notice that the author of the book, as you will have already noted, is British, and so he's using expressions and phrases that we sometimes don't find in American English. So for example, the expression cheek, right, something like attitude, it doesn't exist in American English, but you would know how to classify this according to where it is in the sentence. So even if you have a sentence that contains an expression or words that you wouldn't naturally use in your dialect, you can still give a syntactic analysis of that. So let's look at on the court. So we have on, which is one of our prepositions. It's expressing location. The, our favorite word, which is the definite article, which is a determiner. He wrote the other books, so it fits into the position of a determiner. Court is a noun. Why? Because you can form the plural, courts, one court, two courts. She is the subject of this whole sentence, and think about the test that we did to know whether something is a phrase. Remember that one of the tests was whether you can replace that sequence of words with a pronoun. So when you have something that is a pronoun, like she, he, it, they, them, us, I, all of those guys are going to necessarily be something that is standing in and is replacing a noun phrase. So they will themselves always be nouns. Every single pronoun is always a noun. So openly, we get to an example which is similar to the one that we talked about a couple of minutes ago, where we had disorderly conduct. We had that word ending in ly that looked like it might be an adverb. However, when we thought of the meaning, we thought, okay, disorderly is modifying conduct here. Therefore, since conduct is a noun, disorderly must be an adjective and not an adverb. Oh, remember to also, please, whenever you're labeling, never use a, because then I just don't know whether you're saying it's an adjective or an adverb. So always write adverb or adjective or adv, adj, okay? So what about in this example? How is openly functioning here? She openly displayed a perfectly outrageous cheek. What is openly telling us about? It's telling us about how she displayed a perfectly outrageous cheek. So in other words, it's describing the manner of the action of displaying. And therefore, we know that in this instance, this word openly has to be an adverb because it's modifying something other than a noun. Anything that modifies something other than a noun has to be an adverb. So make sure you have that marked clearly as opposed to an adjective. And then we have displayed. Well, we can break this down into display, which is the root, which is the verb, and this ed, which is telling us what? That this took place in the past. So since we have a past tense form of this item, we know that it must be a verb. So in this case, we have a verb preceded by an adverb. There's no auxiliary verb here. However, there could have been. So if we had on the court, she openly was displaying, something like that, then was would also be a verb, but it's occurring before the main verb, displaying. So the main verb is always going to be the last verb in the sequence of verbs. Everything that comes before that is a verb has to be an auxiliary verb. Okay, so we go to our next word, and we think, okay, can we put it into the position of a determiner? He wrote another book. He wrote another, well, you can't say he wrote another books because it requires singular. But this guy fits into the position of a determiner. What is that position? That's the position initially in a noun phrase as a modifier before the adjective. So you can say the red house, but you can't say read the house because the, being a determiner, has to occur first within the noun phrase. Although semantically it's doing something similar to adjectives because it's modifying the nominal, but because it's a determiner, it has to always be before all of the adjectives. So now we get to perfectly. And again, we have this ly that makes us think, okay, it looks like we're dealing with an adverb here, but how do we know that that's actually correct? Because in the other example, that wasn't the case. So you're thinking about a perfectly outrageous cheek. So cheek is something like attitude, and we know that you could form the plural with that. So that guy has to be a noun. Cheek is a noun. And when you think about outrageous, it's describing cheek, right? It's telling us about the type of cheek. It's really outrageous cheek. It's like way beyond the limit, something like that. And then if we think about how perfectly adds into the meaning of that expression, what does it mean? What's the difference between an outrageous cheek and a perfectly outrageous cheek? A perfectly outrageous cheek is like a really outrageous cheek, right? It's an outrageous cheek that is absolutely unbelievable, something like that. Whereas an outrageous cheek is just saying that, okay, it's cheek and it's outrageous, but it's not telling you that it's completely over the top outrageous. So in other words, perfectly here is giving us information about outrageous. It's saying that it's really, really, really outrageous. So as outrageous is an adjective because it modifies the noun cheek, perfectly is an adverb because it is modifying outrageous. It's modifying something other than a noun. Here it's modifying an adjective, so it must be an adverb. So in these two examples, we saw how examples of words that end in ly can be and often are adverbs. But remember, you have to think about the role that it's playing in the sentence. So then we have towards the officials who had recently been appointed by the club. So towards, actually this is an interesting preposition because in English it can appear in two forms. You have toward and towards. And towards is probably more commonly used in spoken English, and toward is probably more commonly used in written English, but both are possible. So it's giving you the manner of direction towards the officials. It's a preposition, the, determiner, officials, plural s, this must be a noun, who. How do we know what this is? Think about the question that we had when we were thinking about whether something was a phrase or not. So if you say, who left the room, you could give an answer like, the children. What is that answer? It's a noun phrase, the children. So in other words, you know that who is a type of noun. And in fact, it's a type of what we call WH pronoun. But that's not really important. The important thing is that it takes the place of a noun, so we're going to label it as a noun. And then we have had recently been appointed by the club. So had recently been appointed. Let's look at that part of it. Appointed is our main verb. How do we know that? Because it's the last in our sequence of verbs. The very last in our sequence of verbs must be our main verb. And only that can be the main verb. So everything that comes before has to be what? Then has to be an auxiliary verb. Had has to be an auxiliary verb. What about recently? Is this an auxiliary verb? Well, it doesn't look like an auxiliary verb, right? Because it has the ly that we think is going to be associated with an adverb. So we think to ourselves, recently, what is this telling us information about? Towards the officials who had recently been appointed. Recently is describing when the appointing took place. In other words, it's modifying the verb, appointed. In other words, it's not modifying anything that is nominal. Therefore, we must think about it as being, as we would think, as we would expect, an adverb. So recently here is an adverb. Then you have by the club. By is preposition, the determiner, club is the noun. Clubs can be interesting. Club can take the plural and you can put it into subject position. So therefore you know for sure it's a noun. I will be back in a minute with the second sentence.